All right. So let's get started with the final one that we're going to talk about in this group of three. We're going to talk about the Johns Hopkins supplemental essay. And this is one essay. They have made it a little bit fancy this year because it is a big 150-year anniversary, but this is still pretty instructive on how to answer these larger prompts. Their prompt is the following. Over the past 150 years, every monumental discovery at Hopkins has started with a first step, the first draft by a Pulitzer Prize winning author, a prototype that led to life changing medical invention, the first pitch that launched a new startup venture. As we commemorate the university's sesquicentennial, 150 years since its founding, we continue to celebrate first steps just as much as final achievements. Tell us about an important first in your life, big or small, that has shaped you.
There are two challenges that I want to talk about with Johns Hopkins, and this which is why we selected. And one is what we've talked about already. Unlike Yale and Harvard, you have one extra essay in addition to your personal statement and your Common App to kind of make your case or represent yourself to the school in writing. There are other parts that they're considering, but this is the only supplement you get to kind of speak about what Hopkins wants you to speak about. The other thing is that this is an unwieldy, overly wordy, confusing prompt that, quite frankly, based on the blog post that Johns Hopkins has posted about this, they are equally confused about. So the other challenge with this is not unique to Hopkins, but what do you do with these kind of like
Big
prompts that just kind of keep going, right? Well, how many sentences are there? Like 5 or 6, right?
Yeah.
Like they're like, what do you do? Like, how do you answer this without it just turning into a rambling mess? So like, how do you read a prompt to understand how to direct you to what you ask? All right. The first thing I will say, this is a special anniversary for Hopkins, and they have changed the prompt's wording to reflect that.
Mhm.
That said, the actual question here is not all that different from what they've asked in the past.
Mhm.
They're asking one specific thing that kind of slightly reframes the question that they've been asking and chooses you to kind of frame it that way. The first thing I will say is that you need to focus first and foremost on the main task of the question, which is nearly always in the final sentence. Tell us about an important first in your life, big or small, that has shaped you. This is a that has shaped you life experiences question at its core.
Mhm.
The only twist is they're asking you to think about, how was this experience that shaped me a first in some way?
Mhm.
So if you already have a life experiences essay that you've written for Yale or that you've written for Harvard or any other of the dozens of schools that have that question, you can actually ask yourself, think about the same topic, but if I had to focus on a first within that experience, what would it be? Otherwise, it is hard to just kind of like rattle off first. So if you're using the idea of first to brainstorm, you're probably doing it wrong. Start with the context, start with the experience that you've already been thinking about, that you've already been using to kind of reflect your personality and your values and your interests that in all of these other schools. And then how would you frame that, or the specifics of that would frame it as a first?
So ironically,
Yeah.
for this prompt, you're not starting from the start. You're actually going backwards from the result, the thing that makes you really excited, and then going backwards to find where the start was.
I think for this particular question, that is probably the most functional approach. Now,
I would agree.
you might be a little bit different. The idea of writing about a first for you might be more straightforward. You're like, yeah, I've got a couple firsts I really want to talk about. And in which case, this is a much more straightforward prompt in that way. You can kind of say, this thing that I did was a first. This is how it shaped me. But I also think that like you have selected a life experience for these other schools because you know yourself and have like worked through that.
Mm.
You've done that thinking. And that is important to you because you've already chosen it for these other schools. I would also say I struggle to imagine any topic that you could have chosen there that is not going to have first embedded inside it. I am not even confident in some ways that this prompt is all that interested in the idea of a first. I would say that maybe in your conclusion, it would, again, as terms of like reflecting the language of the prompt, making sure that you feel like you're answering the question, you might come back to this main value statement that Johns Hopkins says at the beginning. Monumental discoveries start with a first step. So at your conclusion, you're kind of saying, based on this life experience that I've just described to you, this is the first step, the first that I'm kind of identifying as structurally the thing I'm talking about. And then your conclusion, how has that first led to something greater? In terms of the reframing of the question, that's the only thing you need to really adjust and change from the thinking that you've probably done before.
So when you're reading this kind of question, sometimes it's easy to get distracted by words like important, right?
Distraction. Yeah.
Yeah. Tell us about an important first. Oh, maybe I have to think about firsts. But the real meat of this question is that has shaped you. And once you see that has shaped you, you're like, oh, they're talking about things that have shaped me. This is an important event or experience in my life.
The life part is also a kind of like
Yeah.
little alarms should be going off in your head that they're like
Mhm.
asking about like a life experience or a life story. And
Mhm.
then again, the how it has shaped you, that is like, how have my experiences, in this case, specifically a first experience,
Mm.
shaped me into who I am and how I see the world?
I guess the
Yeah.
next things I want to talk about is how you would like brainstorm and structure this essay and how you pick one thing. But actually, another thing I would love to talk about, and maybe we talk about that afterwards, is how do you make sure that your essay is kind of following the kinds of weird, quirky structures that they're asking for in this prompt?
I don't actually know that they're looking for a quirky structure. I
Mhm.
think they're looking for a slightly quirky frame introduction. So in
Right.
the same that we were talking about is taking those shorter Harvard topics and apply and expanding them out to think a little bit more nuanced in the Yale 400. I think
Mhm.
that's a similar thing that you're doing here, right?
Right.
That instead of just generally expanding in whatever way you see is most fit for your topic, you're thinking about it specifically as a first. So let's
Right.
say you do have a Harvard 150
Mhm.
life experiences essay. Your challenge here then is to say, what is a specific, again, story, because you have 350 words. What is a little story in there that shows a first thing related to this larger life experience or component? And then how does that first experience shape the way that you engage with that larger life experience or context?
Mhm.
And then in your conclusion, again, more directly, how has that shaped you and how has it been the first step, which I do think are keywords in this prompt, the first step to something bigger,
So, can
right?
you give an example of like a Harvard 150 or like a, just kind of an example
Or
of an event?
or a extracurricular activity essay. Like honestly, because could be nearly anything, any
Mhm.
experience that you have had. It does not even have to be a life experiences essay, but it should be an essay that you have already written on a topic you have already decided is important and worth talking about.
Right.
Because this is the only one you get for Hopkins, right? So you don't want to pick some random thing that you haven't really even thought was important enough to talk about with other schools. So because this is your one essay, this isn't like one of the bajillion you get to write for Harvard. This is the
Mhm.
one essay you get to write for Hopkins, which means you need to pick something that you have prioritized in some of the other supplements you have written.
So how
So
do
it can
you
be,
pick that?
again, what do you think? Oh, so what do you think is differentiable enough from your personal statement
Yeah.
that it doesn't just kind of repeat the same vibe, because that's the only other writing that they get to see. So if you're extremely like activity based personal statement topic that shows like leadership and action and community impact, then you might want a more reflective Hopkins essay. If your personal essay is more kind of personal reflection, you might want a more activity driven Hopkins essay.
Right.
But either way, you are picking an essay on a topic and an experience. I do think experience is an important thing. So whether that's a life experience like the Harvard life experience, or whether that's an extracurricular activity experience like the
Mhm.
other kind of middle, that third Harvard essay, or something else, you want to pick something that kind of you think Hopkins needs to hear about and see, then just pick within that, reflect, brainstorm within that larger experience. What was a first that I did? And then orient or shape your response, especially the opening and close of that response around that first. Tell the
Right.
story of the first. If your extracurricular activity was about like leading a research team to do something, blah, 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 right?
Mhm.
Okay, this was my experience. What was my first,
Mhm.
right? Was it my first time in a lab? Was it my first time being team leader? Was it my first time working in this particular field or asking this particular type of question?
Mhm.
What was the first?
Right.
Then tell a little bit of that story, set up that first, tell the rest of it in a very similar way than you did before, right? Like, how did you respond? How did you show leadership? How did you have like engage with the specific research questions that you were kind of dealing with or asking in the lab or context. And then in your conclusion, how did that first step you made lead you to something greater in the larger experience? So it sounds counterintuitive in this case, but I do think you want to kind of, you don't want to shoehorn it too hard. If it does not fit and you can't think of a first, you probably want to adjust your tact. But I think with this one, it is better to come in with an idea about like what thing you want Johns Hopkins to hear about and then frame that thing as a first in some way than to brainstorm fresh a first in your life.
I do want to also call out that you made a point which I think is really important to emphasize, which is that there are many different firsts that an experience can have. It's not necessarily the first time you did the activity, or it may be the first time you asked a question, or maybe the first time you learned something that spurred the rest of this activity. So if it is this example of you led a research team to maybe study chasing rabbits, so maybe it's the first time you saw a rabbit and saw it running and thought, where did that rabbit go? But it also could be the first time you interacted with a rabbit, or the first time you like stepped into a lab and realized, wow, like this is a cool place to work. It could be any of those things. Your first does not have to be limited to one thing. So if you think you like the topic, but you're not sure that the first you're trying to fit works, just pivot. There's so many different ways that things happen, both in life and in these more specific extracurriculars and like they all come from a multitude of places so that you can try another one.
And I would also say with that one, the bulk of this essay, assuming you have other supplements that you've written for other schools, the bulk of this essay, the most
important part
should probably not change all that much from some of the other drafts that you've written. This is about a framework. This is about reframing your introduction to set it up as a first and tell the story as the story of a first, and about your conclusion, which is reflecting on the way that this first that you highlighted at the beginning or that you chose to spotlight. Think of it as spotlighting, right? Spotlighting a first in a story that you've already decided is meaningful and important, and then reflecting on how that first has shaped you and led you to something bigger, right? That first step leading to a monumental discovery or whatever, the equivalent of that for you. And that can be personal reflection, that can be real impact or kind of conclusion. So the first framework exists almost exclusively in your opening paragraph and your closing paragraph. And everything else should be something that you have already decided is meaningful and important to your overall profile. Ignore mostly the elaboration in the middle, the first draft of the book, the medical invention, the new pitch. This is more about like reflecting on a thing that you have done, especially at the starting out point of whatever that is, and highlighting that for Johns Hopkins and making a case for them about why this is who you are, what you care about, and ultimately this idea of like where you're moving with it, both in terms of your personal reflection and kind of what's the next step. And again, that can be personal or that can be more activity or research or intellectually driven. It kind of depends on what you have not already covered and represented in your application in the Common App part. Do not write fresh. Do not write fresh.
Don't do it. This is, we said don't panic. Writing fresh is panic.
Panic.
Don't do it.
Just panic.
I think that I have a couple questions about the supplemental essays in general. But did you want to say anything else about the Hopkins essay?
Not specifically, but I will.
Okay.
I want to kind of clarify a point. I do think it is extremely important to fit your essay to the prompt you are asked. We said it like before with Harvard. Echo your language, echo the keywords in the prompt in the language of your essay.
Right.
That said, very often you do not need to write a new essay for a lot of these. Sometimes you do. That is very rarely the case. This is more about reflecting on the ways that the essays you have already written fit and think about the prompt, and then adjust the language of the reflection and potentially the takeaway that you have. So, for example, we were talking about this with the Yale essays, the community and the personal experience, lots of overlap. Lots of different topics could work equally well for either of those topics. The difference is where you want to take your conclusion. It's that conclusion part, that reflection at the end. That is the part in your essay that is most likely to change as you adapt it from one prompt to the next prompt to the next prompt. So when you're
Right.
thinking about revision and you're thinking about adapting your essays that you've already written so that you're not panicking and just writing word vomit for every school fresh,
Mhm.
right? Reflect on that conclusion. How can your conclusion answer the particular question that is asked in this particular prompt using 90% of an essay that you've already thought through, reflected on, and that represents you in a really positive and useful way?
Right. And that actually leads into my general questions about supplements, which is there are some essays that you'll probably want to keep as the first choice when you're rewriting a new supplement for a different school. I would say those are like the life experience essay, the why am I interested in what I want to study essay, and then I was going to say why this college, but the why this college also has to be pretty tailored for the college.
A leadership and or community impact
Yes.
essay is one that I would say is a very common one you want to reuse. And I think you would want to
Mhm.
reuse based on what you understand to be the personality and priorities of the school. For example, a school like Johns Hopkins, I think while personal reflection, I do think is important to them, I think they are
Mhm.
probably a little more interested in action. And again, if you have not represented that in your PS, I think it's important to prioritize that for your supplement, especially
Right.
for schools that like, again, don't give you that. But Vanderbilt would be the same way. And again, another school where you get one crack at it.
Mhm.
What you choose to prioritize is going to depend on a couple of things. First of all, you know how good your essays are.
Right.
First priority, what's your best essay?
Mhm.
Especially if you have some that are notably stronger than others. Second thing would be like, which essay provides an angle on me that I have not represented well enough already in the other essays that have been included? That
Mhm.
is particularly true for the essays that give you basically free choice. Like, give us an
Mhm.
essay about whatever you think we need to know. And then the third one would be try to match the characteristics and the qualities about you with the school and what they prioritize. And again, you're going to have to
Right.
make, to a certain extent, your own judgment on that. Like, is this more an kind of intellectually, personally reflective school, or is this more a like get out in the community and do stuff? Is this more of a
Mhm.
like, that kind of thing? So that would be what I would say in terms of
Yeah.
priorities and reusing.
I think that's all really good advice. So, in terms of just what you're gonna spend the most time on, try to spend the most time on the things that you can reuse because those are the things that can be the baseline for most of the schools that you're applying to. Northwestern has one that's like, "Hey, what do you like about Chicago?" And the area that we're in. Probably can't reuse that literally anywhere else. But reusing something like a facet of your identity or a community that you're in. These are all things that are much more worth to spend a lot of time on than if you have to triage because it is late and you are not panicking because we told you not to panic, but you are judging judiciously the time that you are spending on each essay. I personally would suggest spending the time on ones that, like, on those kind of core pieces the leadership, the community, the identity experience. And then as you're creating your essays for each college, just polishing them to fit according to the character of the school and the wording and phrasing of the prompt. Does that kind of summarize what you're saying?
100%. Yeah. Judicial time use, don't panic, and look to reuse most of the time you can with a little bit of reflection and a little bit of kind of thoughtful concluding in essays can go a long way before you start rewriting a whole new essay.
This cannot be any more detailed. Like, I don't think I've come across any video that actually breaks down each prompt so thoroughly. So, for those of you listening, better be taking notes because there's a lot to cover. And so, I hope that people actually enjoy this episode, and we'll see you in the next one.
All right, take
Hi,
care.
guys.
Bye.